Hello, and thank you for joining Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security. My name is Ashley Burrell. I'm the Secretary of the Board for Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security. We will be producing monthly podcasts featuring women of color in the peace and security field, so please visit WCAPS.org regularly for more details.
Hello, this is Bonnie Jenkins, the President and Founder of WCAPS. I want to welcome all of you to another edition of our WCAPS Podcast. And today we have with us Rachel Gillum. And she has a really amazing background and very impressive things that she has done. And she is currently at Stanford as a visiting scholar. And I will let Rachel introduce herself in a minute. But I did want to once again remind our listeners to continue to listen to the podcast that we have on our WCAPS website, where we will continue to interview really impressive women of color who are in the field of peace and security and are doing amazing work. So with that, I think I'd like to start. And I'd like to turn it over to you, Rachel. Could you say a little bit about yourself, who you are, and where you're from?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. As you said, I'm currently at Stanford at the Immigration Policy Lab as a visiting scholar there. But I'm originally from Seattle, Washington, and did my undergrad at University of Washington and ended up in California after graduate school and ended up sticking around because the Bay Area is so beautiful. So really love it down here.
And what is your, say a little bit about your educational background?
Yeah, so I came down to Stanford to pursue my PhD in political science. I studied comparative politics, international relations, but my dissertation really ended up focusing on Muslims in the United States and their experiences basically after 9/11, in particular, the changes in security policies, a concern about, stopping homegrown terrorism. I was really interested, in asking the question, we have all these new security policies and institutions and changes, but no one's really asked the question of what are the effects of these policies on, real Americans, living here and Muslims. So I basically ran a nationwide survey of Muslims. I spoke to hundreds of Muslims across the country about their experiences, looked at a variety of different data to assess, what Muslims' roles have been in helping thwart attacks. And in fact, they've been incredibly helpful. And I really just mapped this out actually in my book that actually just came out, Muslims in a Post 9/11 America. And I think it tells a different story than what a lot of, commentary on Muslims tends to suggest.
Well, first of all, congratulations on your book. It's always great to have a book under your belt. I'm still waiting to do that myself. And actually, could you say a little bit more about that? I mean, you said that after 9/11, you were interested in this issue. Is there anything that you think directed you toward that particular issue, or was it just really you just thought this is something I really just want to do out of the blue, or is there a background to that?
There's definitely a background to it. I was working for the government in counterterrorism actually before I started at Stanford. And, I think a lot of us were focused on, the terrorist threat, shortly after 9/11. That definitely was formative in my desire to go into sort of the national security field. But I think being a minority, being a Black woman, I saw a lot of the, some even government materials, suggesting this is how you spot a terrorist, this is, profiling people so blatantly, right? Just based on racial and ethnic backgrounds, based on religious backgrounds. It really, struck a chord that, wow, this type of profiling, I've seen it in my community. And certainly this is having an effect for folks, of Middle Eastern, African, and other backgrounds, who are Muslim, and in fact it does tremendously. And we see a lot of policies that many of such that have now been canceled or no longer in play, but even to this day we see policies that really rely on a lot of profiling or not scientific evidence targeting groups that are supposedly more inclined to be involved in violence, but the real data do not support that at all. And so that's some of the issues I try to address in the book. And that's really what led me to the question in the first place.
Great. And I definitely want to go back to this issue of some of the things that you have found in your book, particularly want to talk about some of the changes that you might have seen since 9/11 on this issue of profiling and how Muslims are treated as a result of these issues like 9/11. But you said that you did some work at the RAND Corporation. Talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So while I was in graduate school, and many listeners probably know when you're pursuing your PhD, you're primarily preparing to be a professor of, whatever the field you're studying, political science in my case. I wasn't always sure I wanted to go into academia, so I took my summers and I would work at different institutions in DC, and the RAND Corporation was one. It was great because I was able to, use my security clearance and work in that regard. And so what I was studying at RAND actually was the recruitment strategies of different terrorist organizations, particularly them recruiting Americans to go overseas and fight. So we saw a lot of this with the Syrian conflict, a lot of outreach by ISIS to folks in the United States and throughout Europe. But we also saw it much earlier when I was studying. I was really focused on the Somali conflict. We saw a big group of Somali Americans, young men who had never been to Somalia or had only been as infants, didn't speak the language. Somehow they were being drawn away to go fight overseas. And many of them, once they get there, they realize this is not what I want to be doing. But unfortunately, upon trying to escape, a lot of them were actually killed or unable to return to the United States. So that was a really interesting project, but really looking at the transformation of al-Shabaab's strategies from very simple videos to then when they actually more formally linked with Al-Qaeda, their media strategies got much more sophisticated and much more effective and was able to draw people from all around the world.
Great, and I'm looking at your resume here, and just to go back to some of the things you've done. I know that you also work for the Center for International Security and Cooperation, and also at Stanford there, and at the CIA as a graduate fellow, Intel analyst. And so, I see that you have been in a lot of the hard security issues, as well as looking at some immigration issues. How many, if you can think back, were there many people of color along the line in your path, during your path as you were going through working in some of these places?
It's a good question. I mean, if I have to sit and think hard, not a lot come to mind, I'll say, as far as the people I was working alongside. But I will say that I had some amazing mentors along the way. Both people of color, as I was an undergraduate, starting to work in graduate school, as I was taking some of these, summer positions. I had some great mentors that really encouraged me. So even though the people I wasn't sitting next to, I had a community, I had advocates and mentors that were really supporting me during that time. So that was really important. And I'll add that I also had some great mentors and advocates that were not people of color that really supported me and helped advance my career. And I think it's key for anyone sort of building their career. It's amazing to have mentors and advocates of color in a community of color, but it's also important to find advocates wherever you can. I think that's just key in advancing and growing and learning and be able to, take from those different leaders in your life as well. I happen to be very lucky in that so I'm a scholar at Stanford, but I also have a full-time job in the private sector, working with Condoleezza Rice and her consulting firm. We advise private companies who are dealing with issues on the international stage. But I'm very lucky to happen to have another Black woman as a great example of someone in the international security realm to look up to. So that I happen to be very lucky, but I realize that's also very rare.
Right.
And so I would just tell people not to be discouraged if they don't, see as many people as they would like that look like them.
Yes, I can definitely relate to that. And one question that I often get from young women is, how do you find mentors and how do you approach mentors? And you've just mentioned that you've had some great mentors, and obviously not all of them were people of color. How did you do that? How did you maneuver the mentorship challenge?
Yeah, it's not always easy because people aren't, always, reaching out to you. People that, tend to identify with you will often reach out to you, and often that is people of color. But in the case of, when you're in a new institution, a new place, I think first step is putting yourself out there, meeting people, getting to know people, letting them know, what you have to offer. And then I think it's, there's a aspect of you get a sense for who is more receptive, more interested in you. And I think it's a matter of sort of cultivating those relationships, showing genuine interest in what they're doing, seeking to learn. I think it's important not to just, be going around seeing what you can get from other people, but having, developing genuine relationships. Because what I've learned is that's really, what brings you, either to the next level or gets you your next job, is people that genuinely know you, genuinely, know that you genuinely care about them, and sort of just developing sincere relationships. I know sometimes in DC and even in Silicon Valley, things can feel very transactional. So for those people you do naturally connect with, I would say just to foster those relationships. It requires putting yourself out there, but I think over time it pays off.
And in addition to the the outreach to mentors, and I'm looking at your resume, and you're a perfect person because I get so many questions from young women, and I'm channeling them through you, because I think it's also good to hear from women like you who've been so successful going through some of these areas that I think other women see as so challenging. What would you say has been one of the challenges that you faced in working in some of the environments like Department of Defense or CIA or in RAND? What would you say has been one of your challenges, and how you feel you overcome that challenge?
Yeah. I think, interestingly enough, and again, this is not to badmouth these institutions. I had amazing experiences with a lot of people, but what actually surprised me is my biggest challenge I felt was not necessarily being a person of color, but being a woman, actually, in these environments in particular. And I'm sure being a person of color didn't help, but sort of starting out in many cases, a lot of assumptions about you not really knowing what you're doing and sort of not really belonging. Frankly, I think some people assume I was there for some diversity program. And I can't tell you how many times, I turn in a piece of work and people say, "Oh my gosh, you can actually write," and they're genuinely shocked. And I'm thinking, okay, I don't know if I should be offended or what. And then so that's one issue. But I think there's also an element of appearing, or being younger or whatever too, that plays a role. But also on top of that, sexual harassment is, and I know there's a lot of talk about this with me too, but sometimes when you're the only woman in the room, instead of someone commenting on your presentation, I've gotten, comments on your legs or how you're dressed, and then of course, much more aggressive and forward situations. And it was a big learning process to learn how to navigate that, how to recognize those situations, before they happen, how to shut them down, know when it's the time to go get some help. Those were actually probably the most standout challenges I had in those environments.
Mm-hmm. And you've obviously figured out how to maneuver that and how to know when to say something, when not to say something. What would you give advice to young women who are, if they face a similar situation? Is there any particular type of advice you could give them?
It's such a hard question because it's so sensitive and it's so situationally based.
Right.
And so by all means, I think there's many approaches and many appropriate responses. The strategy I chose to take, I had actually a sort of a kind of colleague mentor. He wasn't directly working with me, but he was another actually Black person I felt I could confide in on some things. And I mentioned, this several incidents with the same person who, was sort of harassing me. And I sort of mentioned, like, what do you think I should do? And he said, look, you can report him. You have every right to. You have this evidence. He said, and they're going to do something about it. But at the end of the day, you're going to be marked as a troublemaker and you're not going to be able to proceed. And, as horrible as that is, and that's not fair that the burden goes on the woman and all that stuff, I totally understand that. For whatever reason at that time, I took that and I said, he's right. And I took that realist approach. And for the most part, I sort of said, to the degree I can, I'm going to sort of try to stop this, be the first line of defense for myself. So to say very directly to men, I don't appreciate that, please, don't comment on my body or whatever, what have you, this should be. Again, and I want to reiterate, I know this is sensitive because often there's a power dynamic. It's your boss, it's your senior, it's rarely, a colleague or someone under you, which would make it simpler. But, so that was often delicate things, delicate ways to signal, I'm not interested, so you're not embarrassing them, so you're not retaliated against. But anyway, I took the path to make sure I was being very clear in my, in my direct interactions. And then if I needed to escalate it, then I would. Again, very sensitive topic, very context specific. But, I felt it was important for me to also stand up for myself first order, and 99% of the time that shut it down in my case. Again, that's not always the case, and often this needs to be raised to higher levels, but for me that seemed to work.
And you also mentioned you're having a colleague. I think that raises the importance of having a support system where it's possible to have one. Are there cases that you can recall where you developed a support system like the one you spoke about to help you deal with some of these challenges that you can, or how would you advise to go about developing that kind of a support system?
Yeah, so I think, again, it goes back to just developing genuine relationships, taking genuine interest in people at your job. And that can be as much, include mentors and people ahead of you that you hope to be like one day. But it's even the people working at the welcome desk, if you will, all the assistants and associates. Often those people are, saying hello, how was your weekend, and meaning it and listening to what they're saying. Often these are the people who have given me the heads up on opportunities, what's going on in the office, what to watch out for, just to understand the political dynamic of an office. And so, maybe that's just something people don't do enough, but I found that actually being incredibly helpful to getting insight and help navigating some of these sort of tricky issues that can happen in offices that don't necessarily directly relate to your work, the content of your work, that can be very disruptive to your work if you don't navigate them correctly.
And what would you say is a secret to your success?
Oh gosh, I don't, it's hard to say. I think, again, I have to give a lot of credit to all the mentors, again, people encouraging me in my life, my family. And I think with that in mind, my secret for me is keeping my mental health in order by making sure I'm keeping my perspective balanced, right? Not letting work be all consuming, because if you have a bad day, bad week, bad month at work, I don't want that to, leak into my private life with my family and friends. And I use the positive, vibes I get from my family and friends to sort of keep me going, right, in the workplace when work can get hard sometimes. I think also, I'm sure many other people do too. I struggle with imposter syndrome, right? You're in environments, no one looks like you. People are not necessarily assuming you're coming with, the level of expertise or whatever, but I think part of the success, I've tried to use that imposter syndrome, that fear of, being found out, to motivate me to study even harder, make sure I really do know what I'm talking about before I enter the room, before I enter the meeting. So try to channel that, insecurity into a strength as much as I can.
That sounds wonderful. And now I just want to switch a little bit to a topic really, which is about the organization. And what are your thoughts on, on the importance of having diverse views and the views of women of color in some of these foreign policy decision-making establishments through both the process of sitting at the table and also the final decisions? As you know, one of the main goals of WCAPS is to highlight the fact that we need to bring more women of color, people of color, into foreign policy decisions and discussions, particularly since so many of those foreign policy affect people of color around the world, and particularly women of color when you're talking about peace and security issues. So what are your thoughts on that in terms of why it's important to have diverse voices at the table?
Absolutely. It's so important. It's so important, especially in national security, because as you said, the implications of these policies affect so many people in the United States and around the world. We know not only from national security, but we know now from private sector studies, companies that are concerned about making money, it's so important to have diverse groups, because when you have people coming from different perspectives, different viewpoints, and we know that race and gender means that you've had very different experiences in the United States. They bring different perspectives. They bring different ways to look at a problem and an issue, and different experiences problem solving. And we know statistically that results in better outcomes. That results in the case of these studies that I'm referencing, basically more profit for companies, more successful policies. And I have no doubt that that's the same in the national security realm. In my personal experiences, I've seen groups come together, and when you have a group of people that all come from the same, socioeconomic, racial background, same, Ivy League school, they all have been trained to solve problems in the same way, and that's fine. But it's not fine when no one's there to challenge your assumptions, to bring a different perspective, because we see people, say, oh yeah, we all agree, let's move forward on this. And then there's all these negative implications and ramifications that they did not see coming. But if they had some different people in the room, they could have prevented a lot of these. So I think it's incredibly important.
Right, I totally agree with you on that. And particularly in terms of understanding the implications of decisions that are made that will not be quite understood unless you have voices at the table that can understand the cultural aspects of the implications of actions. And just things they're not even thinking about if you don't have diverse voices around the table.
Exactly. Issues that wouldn't have come up otherwise. And we've seen this be so important as we, again, send our troops to different parts of the world, or in the case of my research, implement policies that are affecting that, maybe unintentionally have, been targeted minorities. Again, I'm not saying that the people implementing these policies were intending to profile Muslims or to, make policies that unfairly, criminalize Muslims, but, without perhaps having a diverse group sort of really scrutinizing these policies, again, some of these unintended effects can change real lives. And it's important to know that ahead of time.
And this is a great segue to the work you're doing now. And let's go back to some of the things you were saying earlier, based on the work you've done in your past, as well as the work you've done in writing your book. Let's talk about you've been first seized of this issue, particularly after 9/11. And in the course of writing your book, what would you say was some of the lessons learned in terms of what happened in 9/11, in terms of how we are treating Muslims and today? I mean, are there many changes? Did it get better and then worse again? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. 9/11, when we have to remember what a chaotic, scary time that was. And so I definitely want to acknowledge that there were not the security institutions in place to deal with an attack on the homeland. So, impromptu institutions filled the void, and I acknowledge that and I understand that. But as far as some of the policies that were implemented, we had a program such as the Nasir's program, which was basically a screening program where anyone coming from anywhere in the Middle East or Muslim country basically it was followed and tracked while in the United States had to check in. And that's now gone away, mostly because now everyone is followed and tracked while they're in the United States, no matter where they're coming from, because I think we realize, again, the threat's not just coming from one place. But President Bush did go to lengths to not associate Islam with violence, but inevitably, this fear spread, and many of the policies that were put in place in that administration were really targeting Muslim groups. And we know statistically that Muslims aren't, the ones, creating the most terrorist events in the United States. The Obama administration tried to change the discourse away from what was referred to as the war on terror, and he chose a different word away from terrorism, countering violent extremism, to really sort of try to bring a more holistic approach, meaning let's look at the broader issues that might lead young people into violence, start in the early stages of the radicalization. A lot of scholars, though, still criticize many of these approaches and policies because, again, they were based on, they still targeted Muslims in that, how can we tell if someone's radicalizing? Well, we can tell if they're very religious, if they're politically outspoken, if they wear a religious garb, where does that direct you to, right? That still directs you to Muslims in that regard. So, some of the communities said, President Obama did also go to lengths to try to disassociate Islam with violence and try to, spread, hey, we need to look at right-wing terrorism as well and deal with this as well. But many would say in practice, Muslims have still been targeted. We see under the Trump administration, we see a big change in rhetoric. And I think the scariest thing, not only that he's following through on many of the policies and changes that he said he would do, such as the Muslim ban and some other policies, but he's inspired other people to speak out and act violently against Muslims. So we've seen spikes and hate crimes against Muslims, also against other minority groups, African Americans and Jews as well. Leading up to his election and since his election, we've seen a spike of hate crimes. And we've seen some fear in some cases of Muslims cooperating with police. Muslims have traditionally been extremely cooperative with police, helping disrupt plots, as I show in my book. But it's concerning when the current administration is so outwardly hostile towards Muslims and other minorities that we worry that cooperation will decline. We saw basically a lot of Islamic groups and political organizations that were seeking to counter violent extremism in their communities. They had been awarded grants to do this work under the Obama administration, but many actually ended up turning down this money once President Trump was in office and he was sort of espousing his views of Muslims because they felt that, being associated with the government would hurt their work. It would be counterproductive, and it would just open the door to basically trouble, being associated with the Trump administration. That's really unfortunate. Again, in my book, I find that actually Muslims, we see in a lot of data sources, Muslims are actually the single largest source of disrupted plots in the United States by giving tips to police. So it is really problematic when we don't have that cooperation.
And I'm wondering in your research if you noticed any women who are Muslims. Did you find any indication at all about women being more impacted by these issues at all? Just curious.
In the previous administration, under the Obama administration, I knew a lot of Muslims working on issues of immigration, countering violent extremism, a reasonably robust community. So I definitely saw and met a lot of folks in that realm. In the current administration, I don't know of as many. A lot of the programs that were doing some of this outreach work to the Muslim community, I'm not sure if they still exist, or they're certainly not as robust as they were under the Obama administration. So that's really concerning. I think what we've seen is a lot of people really hesitant to work with the Trump administration, again, because of some of the outward hostility and policies that they've chosen to pursue. There's been rumors that basically the administration is, no longer looking into right-wing extremism, but really doubling down on looking into Islamic extremism and what they call radical Islamic extremism or something like that. So it's not been a friendly environment, and I don't think you see a lot of Muslims or other minorities running to work for this administration.
Right.
Which is concerning because it would be nice to have more people on the inside doing what they can, and I'm sure there are plenty of career folks still working hard on these issues, and we thank them. I know it must not be an easy time to be there right now.
Right. Just since your question about establishing true diversity.
Yeah, so I helped found the True Diversity Initiative within the Truman National Security Project. The Truman National Security Project is an organization based in DC, but really operates all over the country that is seeking to bring together veterans and different security professionals to really inform policy. So I, with a group of friends, namely my partner, Tony Johnson, we founded the True Diversity Initiative because we felt there was a need to really support the few of us who were there, people of color, who were in these different professions. All of us sort of feel like, hey, we're the only one, but to really come together and help, support each other, because we need our voices to be heard and to be amplified in many cases. And so sort of come together to build a support network to do that. And not only to support ourselves, but to look and start to fill in this pipeline. Because what I hear a lot is, from other professionals who would love to hire people of color, they say, well, I don't know where they are. Do they exist? Do we have enough people? And so over the 3 years that I was co-directing that, we started some programs that, started to partner with local universities so that students would have mentors that look like them, so that they could hear from people in the space who look like them, and that we would also begin to connect with this network of students who are thinking about pursuing careers in national security and giving them the tools and encouragement to do so.
Great. And I have one final question. I don't know if you can hear me, but how are you enjoying working for Condoleezza Rice?
Absolutely. Dr. Rice has been fantastic to work for. I met her while I was a graduate student at Stanford. She is herself an academic, professor of political science, and now also professor in the business school. And actually the year I started graduate school is the year she came back from the administration. I had an opportunity to meet her, and she, from just the very beginning, was so welcoming, so encouraging. She said, come meet me, let's meet periodically, and has just been a mentor to me. She just was very open, and I just have found her insight incredibly helpful and thoughtful. And she's been fantastic, and as have the other partners in the firm, Robert Gates and Steve Hadley, and another woman, Anya Manuel. And, these are a group of Republicans, but I'll say, but only because I sort of am more on the left-leaning side of things, but just incredibly thoughtful people, thoughtful about so many issues, and really just appreciate having, good, smart people in the firm doing good work. We're not doing political consulting, we're doing private sector consulting, helping businesses navigate in the international space. And so bringing expertise from all different areas to apply that. So it's really been fantastic working with her.
Excellent. And one final question that I just put up that hopefully you can see. Do you have any final words for young women of color who may want to pursue a career in foreign affairs or international relations?
Absolutely. So for women who do want to pursue a career in foreign affairs, international relations, sort of going back to what I said, it's so important to have mentors and people in your life who you can ask questions, who can sort of tell you the insider knowledge. I think that's the key to so many industries and navigating is finding people who are ahead of you to tell you sort of the inside scoop, to introduce you to that person hiring, to let you know about that job that's not necessarily posted online somewhere, and that's how it works here in Silicon Valley, especially in the tech world, is it's all about your networks. It's all about your buddies and people you know. So I would be really intentional, again, about building sincere, genuine relationships with your peers, with mentors, with people in this space to really learn the inside stuff. And I emphasize this because as I know so many women of color who work so hard in school and who definitely have the credentials, it's really, again, the relationships that are the key to sort of getting into the next step, getting to the next level.
Great. Well, I just want to thank you so much for doing this interview. You are truly an inspiration to women, both young and old. And I'm sure I'll be reaching out to you again at some point just to hear about how you're doing and to also see how, you can continue to be the inspiration that you are to the women of color, young women of color in my network. So I just want to thank you so much again for doing this interview.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, and I'd like to thank all the listeners to this edition of WCAPS Podcast with Rachel Gillum. And so I will look forward to doing another podcast and providing you with more words from really impressive women of color in the field of peace and security. Thank you.
Thank you for joining Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security. Please visit WCAPS.org. That's WCAPS.org.